Howdy y'all, and welcome to Farmers Fight. Today we complete our little micro-series on the yeoman farmer with a look at the South's yeomanry. I wanted to get away from the sort of historiographic approach I used with episode 2, but I sort of went overboard with the reading for this topic. So today turned out to be kind of an overview, kind of a historiography. Also, if you haven't listened to the previous episode, aptly titled Introduction to the American Yeoman, then I suggest you do that before continuing with today's installment. So far, we have been talking about the yeoman in general terms, but it needs to be stressed that the term yeoman and the term plain folk appear to be somewhat interchangeable, especially in early scholarship of Southern society. Although the subject of this episode is the Southern yeomanry, I'm using the term as a sort of catch-all for Southern farmers in general. Also, I wanted to mention that I recently had a baby. I didn't have the baby, obviously. My wife did, and she did an awesome job, awe-inspiring. She and the baby are doing great, but as you may know, everything in our life has kind of been put on hold. I tell you all this because I kind of want to brag, but I also think it's going to put a big dent in my already slow production schedule. It was already tough to find time to read, write, and record each episode, but now I can't imagine what the responsibilities of parenthood are going to do to this whole thing. But as I was recording this episode, which is now 2 episodes, it hit me. I could just, break it up. Whoa. Obviously not every episode can be its own little mini-series, because then we would be in some sort of quantum dimensional spiral, and then I'm doing shows on the Great Mustache and Beer Festival of 1892. So I figured rather than bombard you with episodes that are almost an hour long, I could just make things more palatable and break them up into small bites. That way, maybe I can churn out more content all while taking care of this little baby and give you, the listener, a little break. So for now on, when it's applicable, I'm going to break it up. As always, you can check out the sources I've used for this show by going over to farmersfightpodcast.com and clicking on the link for this episode. Thanks for listening. Episode 5B, The Southern Yeomanry. Last time on Episode 5A, we briefly discussed some general characteristics of the American Yeomanry and took a look at historian Richard Hofstadter's analysis of the yeoman figure in general. To recap, the Hof disputed the idealized image of an honest and virtuous Republican citizen with what he saw as the really existing yeoman, that hurried little country businessman who was more interested in increasing profits by any means necessary than adhering to traditional agrarian values. For my money, I find Hofstadter's view of the yeomanry to be largely correct. A figure akin to the sort of mythic yeoman did exist in the early history of the United States, and also did disappear due to changing market forces. But the mechanisms involved in diluting the yeoman's traditions were not experienced by every small landowning farmer across the country at the same time or even the same speed. By the mid-19th century, the self-sufficient yeoman of American lore had largely disappeared in the North and West. But the South seemed to be a different story. Faced with a far different economic and social arrangement due to the power of slaveholders, the South notably lagged behind the rest of the country when it came to economic and social change. Many contemporaries who traveled to the South from the northern United States or Europe observed that Old Dixie was vastly different from its northern counterpart. A foreign land of sorts, with a people and culture that was incompatible with the North's. For several generations, the most widely read historians who wrote on the antebellum South generally saw the region in this way, and looked to the writings of landscape designer, journalist, and social critic Frederick Law Olmsted. Born in Connecticut to a prosperous merchant, Olmsted developed a strong distaste for the peculiar institution early on, and with it a sorry view of the South in general. Though he was particularly conflicted over John C. Calhoun's defense of slavery, according to historian Arthur Schlesinger, he was a staunch opponent of the practice. Although his views on Southern slavery were pretty well established, it wasn't until he toured the South between 1852 and 54 that he fully formulated his ideas on the South's social structure. In his eyes, only three classes existed in the South: a ruling planter elite, a degraded class of whites, and black slaves. But the idea that the masses of the South's white population was so degraded that they lacked any sort of agency drove later historians to challenge the Olmsted school. Although not a formal historian, one of the first to push back against Olmsted was Alabama lawyer and author Daniel R. Hudley. He saw more nuance in Southern society and was as defensive of the South as Olmsted was critical of it. In 1860, Hudley wrote Social Relations in Our Southern States, in which he described 8 specific social groups. They include Southern gentlemen, the middle classes, Southern Yankees, cotton snobs, Southern yeomen, Southern bullies, poor white trash, and black slaves. But to get a better idea of how Southern society may have actually looked, it might be more useful to turn to some statistical data in the form of the 1850 and 1860 census. Historian Richard Lull and Randolph B. Campbell point out in their book Planters and Plainfolk, which was a study of antebellum Texas, that real property ownership was not evenly distributed. By real property, just think real estate, buildings, crops, and pretty much anything that goes on a farm. In a case study, the pair found that a little more than 30% of farms were not owned by those who worked them. They also found that 0.2% of their sample group held 50,000 acres or more and controlled 12.3% of all real property in Texas. The pair concluded that real property, i.e. farm ownership, was unequally distributed in favor of large farmers, primarily slaveholders who made up less than 10% of Texas's farming community. Additionally, slaveholders who owned no real estate were only about 4.9% of the Texas population, whereas 25% of non-slaveholders were landless. Also looking at the 1850 census, but from a regional perspective, historian Forrest McDonnell and colleague Grady McWhiney, which I've been calling McWhiney, reported that there were approximately 569,000 Southern farms in 1850. About 30% of those held at least one slave, which puts the number to about 170,000 slave-holding farms throughout the South. The same data tells us that about 100,000 farms were considered plantations due to their output. The data also shows that some slaveless single families could and did produce a large enough commercial crop to be counted as plantations, and they were able to do this with actually a minimal amount of labor, according to McDonnell and McWhiney. But perhaps more interesting is that the same data shows 468,000 non-slaveholding farms existed in 1850. Despite being slaveless and often single-family, these farms did not produce enough to be counted as plantations, though the authors make a decent case for the feasibility as to do so. For me, this begs the question of what were these people really doing? What kind of farms were these? If a single slaveless family could achieve plantation yields with relative ease, then why didn't they? We'll try to answer that question here in a second, but first I want to turn back to our discussion about Southern society. Although modern historical research has successfully challenged older interpretations of pre-war Southern society, the views held by Olmsted and later historians persisted well into the 20th century. It was not until the 1940s when historian Frank L. Owsley attempted to broaden the picture by shining a light on the Southern Yeomanry. In his 1949 book, Plain Folk of the Old South, Owsley asserted that the forebears of the Southern Plainfolk practiced a mix of conventional cultivation and animal husbandry in the British Isles for generations before immigrating to the New World. Most had come to North America seeking freehold lands. Some failed and became squatters or tenant farmers, a group that is now recognized by historians as distinct from the land-owning yeomanry and seemed to overlap with poor landless whites, which we will cover in the next episode. But most of these immigrants succeeded and became the sort of yeoman farmer Jefferson idealized, independent and courageous, full of self-respect and a love for freedom. By detailing these people, Owsley broke new ground for historians of the South, as the view up until then was that the plainfolk were nothing more than a marginal and degraded population, ruled by the Southern elite. In contrast to this view, Owsley's primary argument was that middle-class farmers made up the backbone of the antebellum South and were actually more numerous and affluent than previously thought. Rather than ignorant and poverty-stricken waste people, they were reasonably well educated, owned a fair share of land, and were largely non-slaveholders. He said that these folk also did not resent the planter class, but aspired to be as successful as they were. Moreover, Owsley saw their migration westward as driven not by slavery, but by agricultural prospects and a desire for, quote, fresh lands. Owsley claimed that the form of mixed agriculture practiced by those who moved into the pines and mountainous regions of the Upper South settled there out of choice rather than an inability to better themselves or to attain better lands. Along with his wife Harriet and students, Owsley compiled an impressive data set and argued that the antebellum South was in fact not a plantation-dominated society, but rather a plain folks democracy, one whose settlement was decided by choice and luck rather than the economic might of planters. But unsurprisingly, this view of a yeoman democracy was quickly rebuffed, as other historians noted that just because census data confirmed numerous middling farmers existed, it did not mean that they had any economic or political power when compared to the planters. Even though the yeomanry may have seen decent gains in their economic position according to the 1850 and 1860 census, it was relatively minor when compared to the planter class, who was improving their positions considerably as the cotton economy grew and matured during those decades. Owsley was also criticized for downplaying the importance of class and overlooked the role of white women, slaves, conflicts with native peoples, and the general disparities in power and status amongst white men. Still, Plain Folk of the Old South is seen as a landmark work, as it achieved its primary goal of drawing attention to the Southern Yeomanry and their fellow travelers. By highlighting their historical importance, Owsley inspired the next few generations of historians to conduct further studies into this group. After its publication in 1949, debates over the class structure of the Old South did not really take off. This is largely due to the social and political climate of the 1950s and its general aversion to any emphasis on class politics. It was not until the mid-1960s that the question of social and economic power in the Old South was again revisited, but the question of who held the dominant position, the planters or the yeomen, was still left unanswered. Scholars of the era pointed to the lack of research into the economic and social structure of the South as the chief cause for the lingering question. But historian Eugene Genovese worked to address this question throughout the 1960s and 1970s. His 1965 book titled The Political Economy of Slavery and the 1969 follow-up The World the Slaveholders Made are seen as pivotal works in this regard. Looking at Southern society through the lens of Marxism, which is to say he focused on the economic and social aspects of the South's class structure, Genovese's major contribution to the field was to frame Southern society as pre-capitalist, due to its economic dependence on slave labor and relatively shallow relation to consumer markets. Of course, the South had banks, and its elite was certainly interested in wealth accumulation, but Genovese argued that the South's, quote, dependent labor force, i.e. slaves, held, quote, some claims to the means of production, which meant its economic structure was more akin to a feudal baronage than capitalism. More accurately, Genovese determined that the South was a seigneurial society. I hope I'm saying that right. I had to look it up too. It means lordly or manorial. Thus, he saw the, quote, hegemony of slaveholders, led by the planter class, as the leading social force in Southern society. Like Olmsted, Genovese determined that Southern class consisted of three tiers: slaveholders, non-slaveholding whites, and black slaves, with a small commercial bourgeoisie thrown in. He also argued that racial hegemony tied Southern society together and served to quiet class antagonisms between planters and other whites. Over the next few decades, other historians began to incorporate the abundant evidence of deep economic inequality and outright resentment towards the planter class into their interpretation of the Southern plain folk as defined by Owsley. This new information led many to see the land-owning yeoman as their own distinct class apart from those non-planter groups such as laborers, tenant farmers, and poor landless whites, all of which we will discuss in the next episode. But when it came to the yeomanry, historians still posited different views as to the ultimate cause of the pronounced differences between the planter class and the yeoman. Among the various arguments for the economic and cultural disparities, the Celtic thesis stands out as one of the more interesting theories. In the mid-1970s, Grady McWhiney and fellow historian Forrest McDonnell attributed the cultural practices to the South's yeomanry to deeply rooted ethno-cultural values of the Celtic world. The pair argued that most Southern whites were descended from Welsh, Scottish, Irish, Cornish, and Scotch-Irish immigrants, or at least English who were living on the Celtic frontier. In his book Cracker Culture, Celtic Ways in the Old South, McWhiney cites a study of 17th century Virginian settlers. The study shows 90% of them hailed from places like Cornwall, Ireland, Wales, and other Celtic border regions. This is contrasted with another study of the era that shows 71% of settlers in New England were from the Anglo-Saxon east and southwest of the Old Country. McWhiney believed that the original population which settled in the Old South was different from the predominantly English and German-descended populations in the North. In this respect, McWhiney argued that the Southern Yeomanry, which included about 400,000 slaveless farms as we mentioned, had just the sort of economic and social lifestyle they wanted, i.e., the pastoral and leisurely lifestyle of a herdsman who practiced low-intensity agriculture with little interest in maximizing profit if it meant working too hard. They were not interested in keeping up with the planters, so to speak, by investing in slaves and producing cash crops. Subsistence living was just fine by them, according to McWhiney. Any surplus they did create could be sold for cash to pay taxes or to trade for the, quote, necessities of an unhurried life, which is a nice way of saying tobacco and booze. Of those yeomen who did own a small number of slaves, historian John Solomon Otto reports that there was little difference in lifestyle to that of their non-slave owning neighbors, and that they valued leisure and self-sufficiency over wealth. So much so that Otto suggests that they were, quote, easy masters opposed to the large slaveholders. To Northerners, these Southern yeomen suffered from an unfortunate side effect of, quote, the climate and external appearance of the country, which conspires to make them indolent, easy, and good-natured. Obviously a high crime in a mercantilist society. Northern opinions were supported by allegorical evidence, such as the abhorrent conditions of most yeomen's property, and likely the low commercial output of their farms, as reflected in the census data. But though their houses may have been run down and their farms unkempt, they were far from poor, as they always had enough food to be, quote, lavishly self-sufficient. In response to these criticisms, Southerners in every class rejected the North's culturally skewed idea that people naturally sought to advance above their station, especially if their conditions sufficiently met their needs. The difference in Northern and Southern views on this matter were put on display in 1830 when Charles F. Holman tried to convince a Southerner that the North's industry and knowledge was superior. The Southerner's reply rang of traditionalism and old-world agrarian values when he said, quote, if the people don't live up to other people's ideas, they lived as they wanted to. They didn't want to make slaves of themselves. They were content with living as their fathers lived before them. To this point, Friedrich Olmsted said that, quote, the Southerner has no pleasure in labor. He enjoys life itself. He is content with being. Here is the grand distinction between him and the Northerner, for the Northerner enjoys progress itself. This quote makes me think of Hofstadter's depiction of the yeoman as the entrepreneurial and country businessman. When compared to McWhiney and McDonnell's thesis, Hofstadter sounds like he's describing an English-descended Northerner rather than a leisurely Southern Celt. And perhaps herein lies the ultimate utility of the Celtic thesis, as it attempts to explain the cultural differences between North and South in the pre-war years. For McDonnell and McWhiney, the mainly German and English stock of the North saw growth, progress, and general capital accumulation as the primary goal of life, whereas the Celtic-dominated South shunned the idea of progress if it meant industry and cities, as they valued their autonomy and independence far above advancement or money. But regardless of its usefulness, the Celtic thesis has been rejected by some who claim it exaggerates the number and role of Celtic Southerners and puts too much emphasis on the difference between Celtic and English cattle culture. In addition, scholars such as economist James Faust have argued that the yeoman cannot cleanly be divided along cultural lines alone, as they existed on a continuum of production modalities, which included a mix of subsistence and commercial crop production. But even if we cast cultural heritage aside, we can still make a convincing argument that a majority of yeomen made a deliberate economic choice. Their desire to be self-sufficient and lead a life of leisure rather than accrue wealth and attain social mobility was often intentionally made in opposition to that of the modernizing North. As one yeoman put it, the choice came down to either planting one's own corn or growing cotton to buy someone else's corn. But differences did not solely exist between Southern and Northern society, nor between the yeoman and planter elite. Distinctions existed between the Southern yeomen themselves. This demarcation line was found between those located in plantation-dominated regions in the lower or deep South, and those who lived outside of the region, primarily in the upcountry or upper South. According to Jean Genovese, yeomen in the lower and upper South bore similarities in their economic and cultural dispositions. The primary difference between these two groups was their location and general concentration. For example, the yeomen in slave districts exhibited an interconnection with planters that those in the upcountry did not have. Either born out of paternalism or just neighborly goodwill, the planter class tended to reach out to the middling non-slaveholding yeomanry in the deep South. Sometimes this meant helping blood relatives, but mostly hospitality was extended to non-family members. These habits helped solidify the power and influence of the wealthy ruling class in these regions by diffusing cultural tensions. There was also a conscious attempt by these elites to, quote, not act better or offend the non-slaveholding class. This might also be due to what McWhinney saw as the extremist nature of the South's yeomanry. While often, quote, courteous, modest, and even deferential, they were, quote, deadly if provoked, which typically meant disrespecting them or their kin. Like their deep South brethren, yeomen in the upper South were fiercely independent and wary of outside authority. But it was their location in the mountainous and hilly regions of the upper South that served to differentiate them. If those in the Black Belt were more open to the planter class, the geographic isolation of the upcountry helped to entrench hostile feelings towards outside elites, be they northern or southern. Most upland communities were located in the Appalachians, Ozarks, Ouachita Mountains, as well as the plateaus and basins located between them. If you are a visual learner like I am, you can head over to the show's Instagram account, which is Farmers Fight Podcast, all one word, and see a few maps of the area. But in lieu of images, it might be helpful to visualize this area as encompassing the states of Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, West Virginia, and stretching to eastern Oklahoma. Other areas like Upper Georgia and Mississippi, Northwest South Carolina, and a few states that did not secede from the Union like Ohio, Illinois, Western Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri can be included. But for this episode, just think of the southern states located north of the Deep South as the upcountry. Yeomen in these regions largely lived in frontier conditions, with little connection to the lower South. As a result, they were left to shape their own political and cultural structures. Historian Eric Foner points out that, quote, most small yeomen living outside the plantation belt had little stake in the institution of slavery, but they did tacitly accept planter rule in commercial agriculture, just as long as it did not infringe on their autonomy. Despite this unspoken truce, upcountry yeomanry largely hated the planter class and openly jeered their aristocratic pretentiousness. But however deep their hatred truly was, upcountry yeomen did support the political regime of the planters, at least on the national stage. Yeoman Allegiance, if you can call it that, was predicated on elite claims that they were the protectors of the yeoman's independence from outside forces. To this end, the doctrine of states' rights struck a deep chord with the upcountry, who selfishly guarded their autonomy and independence in the face of encroaching northern industry and business. While the planter class was their domestic foe, the yeomanry felt that these elite were the only thing protecting them against the centralization of national political power and the end of their traditional lifeways. However, these Upper South farmers were often loyal Unionists. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, these farmers tended to oppose the extremist and anti-union measures of the planter class and took the political preferences of plantation counties as a negative reference point for their own voting behavior. But their loyalty to the nation came second to their state and region, which trailed far behind their loyalty to their local communities. To this point, McWhinney says that most Southern yeomen did not have much in the way of a class consciousness as Marxists would define it, meaning they did not base their identity solely on being agrarian producers. Instead, they held significant in-group biases, which I interpret to mean strong ethnic, regional, and cultural prejudices, particularly against outside authorities, of which they were very suspicious. All of this says to me that the Southern Yeomanry was better defined as an array of agrarian producers that shared a similar cultural heritage rather than a group or class that formed its identity based on their place in the South's economic hierarchy. But hopefully, as we will see throughout the course of this series, changing economic conditions will push many of these yeomen to look outside of their traditional identities and towards something more akin to our modern understanding of class. So to summarize all of this, we can say that the South's yeomanry, in both the lower and upper South, were mostly an independent bunch who valued self-determination and autonomy at the expense of progress and modernization. While yeomen in the upper and lower South were similar in many ways, they differed in their political preferences in the years prior to the increased sectionalism that led to the Civil War. But the intense guardianship of their freedom led the yeoman farmer and the herdsman who lived outside the plantation belt to eventually back the planter class in national politics. Regardless of whatever commonality the upcountry yeomanry may have shared with northern abolitionists or free soilers in their political views, at the end of the day, those people were still outsiders. Even worse, their policies threatened the yeoman's self-determination in setting their own local customs and institutions. Gina Vasey reminds us that although upcountry farmers largely hated the aristocratic planters, they did not follow them solely out of racial bigotry or provincial ignorance. Rather, they based their support on, quote, rejection of an outside world which threatened to impinge on the cultural as well as the material interest of their communities. It was this somewhat Faustian bargain that may have kept latent class tensions between the planter elite and the larger yeomanry at bay in the pre-war years. As long as the economic might of the planters did not interfere with the yeoman's self-sufficient agriculture and the elite served the yeomanry's national political agenda, then there was no need to stir the pot. Plus, the planters were all too aware of the ideological challenge that could come from an elevated upcountry. This made them all too happy to leave the Upper South in an isolated and pre-modern state. As long as the slaveholders did not infringe on these upcountry regions, their claim as the defenders of local freedom and autonomy against meddling outsiders appeared legitimate. But, and there is always a but, once the Confederate elite made it clear that they were just as tyrannical as any outside force could ever be, the defection rate of those in the upcountry soared. But that is kind of a story for another time. As I mentioned in the last episode, it's kind of difficult to pin down just what the yeoman farmer was, since many groups kind of fall under the same umbrella of that term. But as material realities of independent farmers changed in the post-war South, it became easier to differentiate between these groups. Despite federal punishment enacted on some, a small group of landowning planters remained. They were only about 2 or 3% of the population, but their influence over Southern society was similar to what it had been in the pre-war years. They may have no longer been masters of slaves, but they were still lords of acres. Below them were the small landowning yeomen, who tended to hold about 1 or 200 acres and grew both cash and subsistence crops with a little bit of livestock and poultry raising mixed in. Below them were the renters or tenant farmers. This category was something of a mixed bag, with some tenants operating the same as the landholding yeoman, and others operating as little as 50 to 20 acres, which at that point you start getting into sharecropper territory. By 1880, a quarter of the nation's farmers did not own their own land and were involuntary tenant farmers of some type. The percentage differed by region, but at least 1/3 of the South's farmers were tenants by that time. The increase in landless tenant farming is one of the main factors behind groups like the Agricultural Wheel and the Texas Farmers Alliance. So, next episode we will cover both tenant farmers and the lowest group on the agricultural ladder, wage laborers, or often called poor whites. So until next time, this is Farmers Fight.